everyone, I'm Dr. Sandhya Raman, and this is an additional video just to go into slightly greater depth on why time-restricted eating may be more beneficial if you start earlier in the day and stop earlier in the day. We think that a lot of this benefit comes from our natural sleep, waking, and hormone levels that predict when we're likely to be awake and eating and asleep and not eating.
For example, this study took 93 women with overweight or obesity
who were between the ages of 30 and 57. It divided them into two groups. The first group they called the breakfast group. Here, they asked them to eat most of their calories in their first meal of the day, then a middle number of calories in their second meal of the day, and their third meal of the day, they asked them to eat the fewest number of calories. Their second group they called the dinner group, and this had the exact reverse of their calorie pattern during the day. So they ate the fewest number of calories at breakfast, middle number of calories at lunch, and the greatest number of calories at dinner. They asked them to eat this way for 12 weeks, and the researchers took a series of measurements at the start of the study and then again at 12 weeks. And this is what they found. The breakfast group had reduced more waist circumference, they had lost more weight. They also found that they had reduced their triglycerides, which is how we store fat, by 33.6%. Meanwhile, the dinner group had actually raised their triglycerides by 14.6%. Now, the relationship between triglycerides and having excess weight goes in both directions, meaning that if you have more weight, you tend to have high triglycerides, and if you have high triglycerides, this tends to result in greater weight gain. They also found that when the breakfast group and the dinner group were given meals, the rise in glucose and insulin was lower in the breakfast group compared with the dinner group. And they also found that levels of the hunger hormone ghrelin were lower in the breakfast group compared with the dinner group. So it does seem that one of the ways in which the breakfast group seemed to lose more weight is that they had fewer hunger hormones in their bloodstream driving their appetite, and this led to greater weight loss. Other reasons may be that the hormones that we use to digest food are more active earlier in the day compared with later in the day. For example, our insulin system, which we use to push our glucose into our cells to be used as energy, is more active in the earlier part of the day compared with later in the day. That means that we deal with the energy in our bloodstream much better in the mornings and the early afternoons compared with late afternoons and evenings. Similarly, our sleep hormones, such as melatonin, start to rise in the later part of the evening, roughly about a couple of hours before we want to go to sleep. Now, melatonin has an interesting effect on the release of insulin into our bloodstream. It directly inhibits the release of insulin by our pancreas into our bloodstream, meaning we don't deal that well with sugars and calories later in the evening because of the effect of our sleep hormone melatonin. Melatonin starts to fall in the mornings after we wake up, particularly in response to sunlight. So that also means that our first meal of the day, we should ideally wait at least an hour, by which time melatonin should start to fall in our bloodstream, especially if we expose ourselves to bright sunlight first thing in the morning. Another question that researchers had is whether the benefit of eating earlier in the day and stopping earlier in the day is because of eating fewer calories and feeling less hungry, or because our hormones that metabolize our food are more active earlier in the day, and therefore we burn more calories in the earlier part of the day. So is it that we eat fewer calories, or that we burn more calories, and that's the benefit we get from eating earlier in the day compared with later in the day? And that's what this very small but well-defined study had a look at.
It took 11 men and women with overweight,
and it gave them the same number of calories to eat, either in an earlier window or in a later window. And the later window was the average of the time window during which an average American eats. They did this for 4 days, then they sent them home and they brought them back and swapped them over. So those eating in the earlier part of the day were now swapped to the later part of the day, and those who had originally been eating in the later part of the day were swapped to the earlier part of the day. And that way we could start to tease out whether this was down to individual variability or down to the time of day that they were eating. What they found was that eating at the earlier time of the day led to a small increase in the amount of energy that it took to absorb, digest, and metabolize the food they were eating, only by a small amount, 20 to 40 calories. This is known as the thermic effect of food, and what it's really saying is just the energy to burn the calories we're eating is greater if we eat those calories earlier in the day compared with later in the day. Now, given the very, very small size of this study, it's hard to say that this was a meaningful result. Another finding they had were levels of hunger and satiety hormones differed between the early group and the later group. But this also correlated really, really well with the participants' subjective feelings of hunger. So it does seem to be that if we eat earlier in the day, our hunger and satiety hormones help us feel more satisfied with the same food that we eat, the same number of calories we eat, as long as we eat them earlier in the day compared with later in the day. Finally, really interestingly, although the study found that whilst we may not burn more calories necessarily, we seem to preferentially burn fat if we adopt an earlier time-restricted pattern compared with a later time-restricted eating pattern. Now, this was a really short and small trial that was designed to give us an insight into the mechanisms by which eating earlier in the day seems to give benefits. It wasn't really designed to tell us what would happen over a longer period of time. What it does seem to suggest is that adopting an earlier time-restricted pattern of eating seems to work better for our natural rhythms, for our hormones that balance our hunger, our satiety, our metabolism, and that may be the reason why we benefit and why the studies seem to indicate that we benefit from adopting an earlier eating pattern compared with a later eating pattern. The same research group in a different study found that adopting an earlier versus later eating pattern led to a more than 2 kilo greater weight loss over 14 weeks, which is roughly equivalent to reducing your daily caloric intake by about 213 calories a day. That may not seem much, but over time, that could really add up. So overall, it seems that eating our calories earlier in the day provides the greatest benefit compared with, say, for example, skipping breakfast and then pushing dinner later on into the evening. And it seems to give us this benefit because it works really well with our natural circadian rhythms, our hunger and satiety hormones, and our metabolism. Ideally, wait an hour after you wake before having your first calories of the day. At this point, the melatonin levels in your bloodstream should be dipping, and this is more encouraged by exposure to bright sunlight. Stop eating within an 8 to 10 hour window, and at least 4 hours before your bedtime. That'll allow you to fully digest your last meal, so it doesn't interrupt your sleep and it optimizes your digestion. As with all significant lifestyle changes, have a chat to your healthcare professional before you make any significant changes in case they aren't suitable for you and your specific circumstances. Thank you very much.